Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Letter 7, Seneca is going to provide some advice to his interlocutor Lucilius, and he's going to say, do you ask what you should avoid more than anything else? A very smart question for someone who wants to develop their character and have a good life and, build a plan of life. And Seneca says one thing, a crowd, turbam. And so this is a term for a crowd, but you can think of it in terms of its cognate turbulent, right? People who are jostling each other here and there. And he's going to talk about a public spectacle and go into very graphic detail about this that we'll get to shortly. But we could apply this to so many things in our own time and culture because we typically don't have arenas filled with deadly gladiatorial shows, but we have all sorts of other things that can develop our cruelty and inhumanity and wind up making us more vicious people. And notice that Seneca is not putting himself up on a pedestal and saying, yes, young man, you must do these things that I did in my own time. Seneca says, we're all still invalids. We're all still people who are sick, we're struggling and recovering from a long illness. What is this illness? It's taking place within us, and it's going to be the vices which affect our character. Character in this is translating mores, which means our habits, our dispositions, the ways in which we approach things. And Seneca is going to say, it's not safe for you yet to trust yourself to a crowd. I'll admit my own weakness in this regard. And he says this really fascinating thing. Never do I return home with the same character I had when I left. And character there is mores. So it's not as if his entire character has changed, but the composite of these habits, these dispositions that have been developed. It might just be one that's changed a little bit. But that's enough to say, I'm losing something. I'm losing some progress when I do that. He says, always there's something I had settled before that is now stirred up again. Something I'd gotten rid of that has returned. And he says, contact, conversatio, with the many, multa, right? The many people is harmful to us. He's also going to use the word a little bit later, public. So we've got crowd, many, public, expressing the same basic idea. And why is this the case? Well, because we're going to run into people who are going to help produce bad things, faults, vices, vitiam, within us. Sometimes it will be by urging some fault on us, actually advocating for something. Sometimes it will be imparting a vice to us. And as he says, sometimes a person will even contaminate us without us realizing it. Now, contaminate, ad linet or a linet, right? Which means to befoul, to besmirch. So contaminating is in the sense of like smearing crap on you, right? They've walked in dog poop or something like that, and they've got it on their hand and they put it on your shoulder. You don't even realize it, but your clothes are now gross, right? You're like, What's that smell? Well, it's you, because you went out there into the crowd. And he's going to talk about several different important factors here. So one of these is kind of a rule. The larger the group we associate with, the greater the danger. He doesn't explain why, but we could think about that. Well, the larger the group, the more opportunities you have to run into people who are going to be a bad influence on you, or are going to give you a bad example. But there's also something about the social pressure of being in a large group. There's something contagious about being part of, as he's going to say, a public spectacle. And, the example that he uses here, again, very graphic. I don't need to talk a lot about this. He says, I found myself at the midday show expecting some amusement or wit, something relaxing to give people's eyes a rest from the sight of human blood. So there's been killings in the ring before that. And he's like, maybe I'll, see something that's not that. Nope. It's actually worse. He says the trifling was over. Now it was unmitigated slaughter. Instead of having people with armor fighting against each other or being thrown to beasts, it's people who are, naked basically with swords going at each other, and the crowd cheering and yelling and wanting them to fight. This is not good for somebody, but we could think about so many other spectacles. We don't, as far as I know, I won't speak for you, go to gladiatorial contests, but there's so many other things that we could easily participate in that are not going to be good for us in that respect. So he says nothing is as destructive as occupying a seat in the public spectacle. Why? Because the pleasure that we take in it lets the fault slip in more easily. So this is another sort of rule or explanation, right? When we're actually enjoying ourselves, it's easy to say, it's just this once. It doesn't really affect me. I'm not going to be changed by this. And Seneca thinks that is a foolish thing to tell ourselves. He says, what do you suppose I mean? Do I come home greedier, more power hungry, more self-indulgent? Worse, I come home more cruel and inhumane just because I've been among these humans. Now he's talking again about the gladiatorial show. But cruelty, crudelitas, is something that Seneca thinks we have to avoid. Now, a little bit later, he's going to say, it's all too easy to follow the many. Even Socrates or Cato or Laelius could have had their character shaken out of them by the multitude that was so different. So Socrates, you know who he is, if you know anything about philosophy, a person of very high character. There's all sorts of stories about him. The Stoics held him in high regard. Cato was a Roman statesman who was known for not only being a Stoic and participating in the civil war against Julius Caesar, but for being basically unshakable, not only against Caesar, but also against the tyrant Sulla before him. If they'd hung out with a crowd, Seneca is saying, their character, their mores, their habits would have inevitably been shaken. So it's better that they didn't do that. And then he says, that goes all the more for us, you and me, who are just beginning to establish inner harmony. We can't withstand the attack of faults that bring so much company along. A single example, he says, will do us harm. And what are the examples? Self-indulgence, greed, being dissipated with respect to lust. A wealthy neighbor inflames one desires. A spiteful companion infects the most open and candid nature with his own canker. And then he says, so if this is going to happen with individuals, what do you think happens with a character that's under attack by the public at large? And then he says, you must either imitate them or hate them. So there's two possible negative responses. Imitate them because you get dragged along and you get corrupted by the crowd. And is that a good thing to do? No, Seneca says, well, don't imitate the bad because there are many. The fact that there's a lot of them doesn't mean that they're worthy of imitation, right? But you shouldn't have this counter response of hating them either. That's actually not good for you. Hating, not just despising, but hating. Odious. Don't become hateful to the many because they're unlike you. So don't turn yourself into the wrong kind of elitist, we might say. Are there positive responses that we can have in place of these negative responses? Seneca not only would it say yes, but he advocates for them and tells them what they are. He says, retreat into yourself as much as you can. So withdraw into, we sometimes talk about the inner citadel or a retreat within yourself. So that's important. But that doesn't mean leave everybody behind. Why not? Because there should be relationships. And so he says, spend time with those who will improve you, who will make you better by their example, by their conversation, by, maybe sometimes telling you you're screwing up, man. Right? So spend time with those who can make you better. And you should spend time with some who are not as good as you, because you can actually make them better in return. Doesn't mean you should indiscriminately take anybody in, but he says, extend a welcome to those you can improve. So if you think that somebody could be helped out, let them in. And then he says the effect is reciprocal, mutuo in this, because people learn while teaching. So this is going to affect Seneca himself. He is teaching Lucilius something that he has learned, but he's also learning it while he's teaching. And this is where we get to something very interesting. Seneca himself is, in a certain sense, embodying this, right? So he says, from whom did I learn these things? You don't have to worry that your time has been wasted so long as you learn them for yourself. And then he says, so that my own learning today will not be for myself alone. I'm going to share 3 exceptionally fine sayings that come to mind, stuff that I've actually learned myself as having some bearing on the point of mind. So he talks about Democritus, who says, one person counts as a nation with me, a nation as one person. And then he says, there's a dispute about the second one, who the author is, who, when asked why he expended such efforts over a work of art very few could see. You could think about all the things that we do that perhaps we think, nobody's ever going to notice this. A few are enough. One is enough. Not even one is also enough. And then for the third, he brings up Epicurus, writing to one of his companions in philosophy, who says, I write this not for the many, but for you. You and I are audience enough for one another. And he says, okay, Lucilius, take these ideas to heart and, direct your goods inward. Make this something for yourself so that you don't need to seek out the praise of the many and get distracted and have your character worsened by your association, your involvement with them. Instead, try to have this positive response instead of the negative responses, and you will thereby avoid the problems that come about with others making you worse off, particularly when you put them all together into a crowd.